Thank you. So yesterday I was asked, did you dye your hair to match the title sponsor who's sponsoring your talk? And my answer was, of course I did. Yes, I do that for every talk. So regardless of whether or not it was an accident or intentional, I'm very, very grateful for Beat for sponsoring this. And I'm also very grateful that Beat exists, because I have learned after 3 days in Athens, I never want to drive here myself. I will leave that to the professionals. So we're going to talk about empathy today. You are at the right conference, I promise. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about kind of my background, how I got interested in empathy, and then specifically how I got interested in empathy in the context of software. So when we think about empathy, we usually think of it as this squishy, touchy-feely thing. And it is. It's hard to define, it's hard to codify. And for those of us who really like to have things into those nice little boxes and those nice little yesterday Alistair talked about the shu han ri. So the shoe boxes, everything clear. This is a tough one. But I'm going to do my best to kind of describe it. So my background is I am from the business, right? My background is in business. I have a degree in marketing and business law. And I was trained how to run a waterfall organization, all right? 10 years after I graduated, I connected with a friend from school, and he told me, Andrea, I have this great idea for a software company. I love working with legacy code, and I love using Agile and XP principles to do it, and I'm very good at the engineering side of it, and I have no idea how to sell it. And your background in marketing, and we know each other, and this is all good, please join my startup. And I said, I literally don't understand half the words you just said. XP, what is that? I don't know. And he said, it's all about bringing people who build software and who have, the technical knowledge with the people like you who understand the business and getting us all to work together. I think you would love it. So I was like, okay, we'll go for it. And we created a company called Corgi Bytes. And then later we created a podcast called Legacy Code Rocks. And we talk about legacy code in this way. The interesting thing is that 3 years after starting the business together, Scott asked me another question, and we got married. So if anybody in the audience is looking for a good pickup line, I'll give you half my startup. Just happened to work for me. We're always looking for awesome guests, so if anybody here wants to geek out about legacy code at some point, it's a fun show. We're always looking for awesome people. So I understood empathy, all right? Empathy is a skill that in all of my marketing classes, I had to learn. They teach this skill for marketers, for writers, for journalists, for therapists, for researchers, right? This is a technical skill that I was taught, but Scott, who has his degree in computer science, they just kind of said, oh, you just need the math stuff. You just need the engineering stuff. But I took classes in this stuff. Like, I understood it on a very deep level. And what I've discovered in my decade since I joined and started in the software world is that if the goal is to deliver something quickly, we need to collaborate, right? I think we can all agree on that. But it can't stop there. If we need to collaborate, we need to build trust. And even that's not enough. What is the atomic activity that needs to occur in order for trust to generate? And that is practicing empathy. We'll go into what empathy is in just a minute. But I want to just talk to you really quickly about that word practice. All right? We practice other things. Yeah, sorry. I speak a lot. I have loud. Better? We practice a lot of things. We practice sports. I was going to say soccer, but I realized y'all say football. So, you know, we practice sports. We practice music. We practice coding, right? Who here was born out of the womb knowing how to do test-driven development? I see a couple of hands. That's awesome, right? The rest of us had to learn, right? So these were skills that we had to acquire. And empathy is very, very similar. We all have the capacity for it, right? But this is something that we do every day by practicing. So what's the first step if you want to practice empathy? The first step is recognizing that it is a skill and not a trait. You all have empathy. Every single person in this room. And if you say that you don't, you're lying to yourself. And I think of it kind of like the flip side of this coin. Scott came to me because he said, I don't understand the messy people stuff. You get that, you go do the people stuff and I'll do the software stuff. And you know, I don't really get empathy. So you go do the empathy stuff. And when I came to him, I said, that's okay. You know, I'm not technical. I used the word non-technical a lot until I realized that I was telling myself a lie. Just like Scott was telling himself a lie, saying that he didn't have empathy or he didn't understand the messy people stuff. It wasn't that he didn't understand it, it was that he hadn't practiced it enough. He hadn't practiced it in the right way. And this is dangerous thinking. Because when we tell ourselves these lies, we start putting ourselves in silos. It is not management that's coming down from afar and saying, okay, you guys go over here and you guys go over here. We tend to self-select with people who look and feel like us, right? So, you know, people who are good with machines will kind of go over here. People who say that they're good with people. And then we just label those things, marketing and engineering, right? So if we want to start breaking down some of those silos, we all need to agree that we are all both capable of being good with people and learning how to code and being technical. We are all full human beings. And I would argue that if you work in the software industry, it is impossible to call yourself non-technical. So just stop using that word. So empathy is a skill. Empathy is a technical skill. Empathy is a technical skill that is critical for maintaining and sustaining software systems. And so let's dig into a little bit about that. So first, what is empathy? I've been using this word a lot. Let's start by just kind of grounding ourselves in a definition. The best one that I have, like one of my favorites, is Indy Young. And she wrote this great book called Practical Empathy. It is essentially a user manual for technical people on how to develop empathy. It was written, it's really popular in the UX kind of world. And if you are more on a back end or in the front end and you're not kind of really in that world, I guarantee it'll make sense to you. It's a good book. Indy is a programmer herself, so it was a really great read. And so she was the first one that I read, and it was like, no, empathy is a skill. And there's two different parts to it. Empathy is developed by listening and understanding. So that's the research side of it. We want to get rid of all of those assumptions. Just like we want to get rid of the assumptions in our code, we also want to get rid of the assumptions when we're dealing with people, right? That's called bias and stereotypes, right? It's not so good when you're dealing with people. You want to ask people about themselves, and then you want to make sure that you really understood them. And then once you feel like you've got that good understanding, then you apply empathy, right? So you are in a context where you put on that perspective, you put on that lens. In her book, she also talks about how there are 6 different types of empathy. And this was the moment where I was like, oh my gosh, there's 6 different types of empathy? Anything that you can categorize into 6 different subsets is pretty technical. And if you dive down into the research, you'll discover that this is just as technical as any of the tech stacks or things like that. Like this stuff goes on very deep. The talk I'm giving today is just the tip of the iceberg. So we'll just kind of go over quickly what those 6 different types are that Indy outlines in her book. So the first is mirrored empathy. All right? I learned this when I was in sales. That was one of my very first jobs out of college. And mirrored empathy means we have mirror neurons in our brains, right? Which basically say, oh, I'm going to kind of act the same way other people act. And this is kind of more innate, but I can consciously override that. So if I'm in a meeting, you know, body language is a big way with this, right? So if I'm standing with my arms open, my body language is relaxed, that means I'm approachable. If I smile, right, other people think, okay, but if I'm standing there like this and I've got a scowl, like people aren't going to approach me, right? So this is the mirrored empathy. It's us sending signals out into the world of how we want to be perceived. And this is really useful for building rapport, right? So if you're looking to build trust, or you know, you're just meeting someone for the first time, learning to smile, kind of put your shoulders back, even if it feels uncomfortable, it's a habit, right? And it's a habit that you can build, and it's a habit that gets more comfortable over time. So the next one is emotional empathy, and this is sometimes referred to as affective empathy if you dive into the research. And what this is like, if you've ever seen a movie or read a book and you just like got carried away and you really connected with either that character or another person, maybe it's a story that you read, you know, about someone who's really struggling, you know, or you saw a commercial where it generated a lot of emotion, right? That is the emotional empathy, right? And people think that this is just the only type of empathy. It's a good one, right? And we definitely need it because it helps us forge that connection with other people, but it's not the only one. Next one is empathetic concern. So this one is I have empathy. I have like made that emotional connection to someone, and now I do something about it. I feel concerned about my friend who I see is struggling, so I'm going to help them in some way. I'm going to take an action, right? Personal distress. I personally struggle with horror movies. I struggle with blooper reels, because whenever I see someone like, you know, ride a bike up a ramp and then fall down, like my body goes, ah, and I physically feel that emotion. Like I physically feel for a hot sec, like what they're feeling. And some people are more sensitive to this than others, right? But we all have this to some degree, and that's called personal distress. We have self-empathy. Super important, right? Empathy is not just for everyone else. We can also turn empathy inward and remember ourselves and think about our future selves. We're going to be talking about this a little bit later on. And then finally, we have cognitive empathy, all right? And this is the type of empathy that I learned in school. This is a rational, and I would argue analytical process for going through and understanding how someone else is feeling and then how to connect to them. This is what marketing and advertising is all about, right? Marketing and advertising is all about understanding other people and then creating that emotional connection, right? And sometimes it can be used for manipulation, right? I'd like to think that we didn't do that. But when you're trying to genuinely come from a place of service, servant leadership, you know, this is a really, really useful tool. So the way that we describe empathy at Corgi Bites is kind of we distilled all of that down, and kind of the practical definition of empathy that we have kind of working is that empathy is proactive perspective taking and problem solving. And guess what engineers are really, really, really good at? Problem solving, right? And so when we frame it in this way, it becomes less touchy-feely and more, okay, I can do this. I can learn about someone else, right? We do that all the time in software anyway, right? That's the whole point of building stories and scenarios and behavior-driven development, right? Like, it's understanding something, validating that you understand it, and then problem solving against it. And so we can take those same traits that we're really good at, and we can apply them in the human realm too. So the next question is, okay, so how do we practice building empathy? All right, so we've established kind of what it is, maybe why it's important a little bit. And so now, what are some very practical and tactical things that you can do immediately when you walk out of this room to start building up your empathy? You can start practicing just like you would the piano. So one of my favorite books on this is Dr. Brené Brown. It's a book called Dare to Lead. She has a bunch of other books too, but I think this one synthesizes it really well. It's kind of a synthesis of all of her other research. And she has studied shame, blame, and vulnerability, of which empathy becomes a thing. She talks in the book about how shame, which is the intensely painful feeling of feeling like you don't belong, right? Which is pervasive in the software industry. I still sometimes feel like I don't belong. And I know a lot of us sometimes feel like we don't belong, right? Like if you code in C# and then you go to a JavaScript meetup and they're like, what? You don't know about the latest JavaScript framework that just came out 90 minutes ago? What are you talking about? Right? So we have a lot of these kind of shaming triggers. And so from her research, what she's discovered is that empathy is the antidote to shame. The way she describes it, if you have shame in a petri dish, you douse it with empathy, it can't grow. So if you've got a shame-driven culture, if you feel like you've got a toxic culture at work, empathy is your solution. Empathy is your antidote. And so in this book, she talks about that in great detail, but she also gives 5 practices for actually instilling empathy on a regular basis. And those 5 things are perspective taking, right? Same as Indy Young, right? It's learning how to see someone else's point of view. Non-judgment. This one, some people have trouble with, right? But it's keeping an open mind, right? We live in a world today where things are very polarizing, right? And so just being open to other people's opinions, open to other people's perspectives, realizing that their perspective is their truth, that's all non-judgment. Focusing on intentionally understanding other people's feelings, and then also rephrasing that and communicating how you understood those feelings so that you're not assuming anything. All right, so there's a lot of validation in there. And then the last one is mindfulness, which some people might think, wait a second, I don't do mindfulness. That's a yoga thing. Again, you're getting a little woo-woo here. Mindfulness is just the practice of noticing. That is all it is, right? And again, most of the software developers I know are really, really, really good at noticing things. Semicolon out of place, done, got it, right? After like 19 hours of digging for it. But we're really good at noticing things. And so mindfulness, that's all it is the practice of noticing. So those are some very practical ways from Brené Brown's work. Another really good book that is kind of popular in the software development circles is Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg. And his framework is similar, but kind of got a little tweak to it. And so he says that the skill for nonviolent communication is to express honestly, so you share what you're feeling honestly, and then you also receive empathetically. All right. And there are some kind of ideas that he had in here, such as ask before you offer advice, right? That's kind of a good idea. Listening to feelings, and then reflecting back those messages. And then you can also empathize with silence, right? So just listening and listening for that feeling and the needs, and like not trying to jump to a solution right away, but really allowing yourself to understand that perspective is an important part. And this book actually, the CEO of Microsoft requires all of his executives to read Nonviolent Communication. And this has been transformative in the Microsoft culture. And he's quoted as saying that it went from cutthroat to creative. So, you know, again, stuff matters in software. So one last is Indy Young's book, Practical Empathy. And you can think of all three of these books as like tech manuals. So if you wanted to go and dive deep into empathy, these are three great resources to start. And so some of her suggestions are to do what she calls listening sessions in order to develop that rapport and get that understanding. So starting with kind of a broad topic and then narrowing down. Using the fewest number of words possible to ask your question. Again, silence is the key, and just kind of allowing space for people to express themselves. Avoid jargon, right? That's kind of a good thing, right? Because otherwise that puts us in the othering. Try not to say I, right? So when you're listening to someone, it's not about your experience, right? It's not about you as the person who's hearing. You are just trying to listen. You're asking questions, being inquisitive, being supportive and present, resisting the urge to demonstrate how smart you are. Yeah. And then neutralizing your reactions. This is actually a really tough one for me. I'm very animated, as you can tell, very animated. I'm very expressive. And so for me, like one of the practices that I have to do is like when I'm listening, not like having crazy animated faces. All right, so let's talk about how empathy helps us improve our code, right? We're here at a software conference, so, okay, get to the code, get to the technical stuff already. All right, so Michael Feathers defines legacy code as code without tests, right? That's a great definition, right? As I started diving in, I realized that to me, it didn't really feel complete, right? When I think of legacy code, and in my experience over the past decade of dealing with this, I think of it more as code without trust. And the reason that we don't trust the code is because we don't have context. Now, tests are a really, really, really good way to get context of a system, but it's not the only way. And so the metaphor that I kind of think of, and you know, I wasn't the first person to come up with this, someone way smarter than me discovered this metaphor, but the idea of software archaeology. When you're diving into an existing system, right, whether it's difficult to work with or not, if you're diving into something that already exists, you are exploring the work of someone in the past. And this can be an amazing and fun and exciting experience, right? All of the guests that we talk about on our show, like the podcast, this is a lot of fun. So I like to think of tests as kind of the bones, right? Bones can tell you a whole lot about a civilization, whole lot. Right? But there's other things that archaeologists use to understand the context of a civilization and to propel that civilization into the future and to keep it living. Right? So those might be things like coins or pottery or tools that people used, and then also writing. And this made me think, like, we're here in Greece, and it made me think a little bit about the Minoan culture, right? So we know a lot about the Minoans because we have their pottery, we have their artifacts, we've found some bones, but their language, Linear A, we have not been able to translate. We can translate their, it's kind of, daughter language, Linear B, but that means that we don't have as much context about the Minoan culture as we do about the Athenian culture, right? And if we think about it, I mean, the language that I'm hearing in the halls is thousands of years old, right? That has been continued over time. And so if we want our software systems to continue in perpetuity, we need to create durable artifacts of our thinking, not just the code itself, but the durable artifacts of like what our ideas were, so that the people who come after us, whether it's not because we leave a job or we get promoted or, we move to a different team or we retire to Fiji, whatever the context is, but you will not be the only person who works on this software forever. So having the empathy and having the foresight, I loved the topic yesterday about future-proofing, right? That's what we're doing here. We're taking a moment to say, what is somebody who's coming after me going to need? That is practicing empathy. So, do we leave artifacts of our thinking to help people come after us? And that's not just other people, that's ourselves as well, right? That's ourselves 6 months after we worked on something and we come back and go, wait, what was I thinking? You know, it's very easy to come back to code, you know, a day, maybe a week even, after you've developed it. But over time, you move on to other things. And so thinking about, okay, what's going to be useful to me once I've left this context and then have to come back. And that enables us to speed up delivery much faster. So I started thinking about the kind of ideas of communication artifacts, and I was invited to speak at a group in London. And so I was like, okay, let's brainstorm all these different kinds of types of artifacts. So I just gave a quick, you know, it was kind of a workshop. So I was like, okay, write down all the different types of ways that you use human language, or natural language, sometimes as it's referred to, in the course of a day, you know, your software development. And I love this. It says, write a few Post-it notes, she said. Right? Everyone just started writing all these different ideas, because as soon as you start thinking of it, you realize that there's a lot of places where we're writing these durable artifacts. So what we did next was, you know, kind of standard affinity grouping. Now you can do this. I would encourage you actually to go back to your teams and run through this exercise. And then think about all the different ways that you could group them, right? So they were thinking like near to the customer, far to the customer, you know, short, long, like so. The one that I'm presenting here is just the one that I kind of happen to like, but I would encourage you to go through this process on your own with your own teams. So this is just a small list of all the different types of communication in software. It's a lot, right? So up at the top here, we have stuff that's in the source code, like in the source code repository. And so you'll see source code, right? Over here, we have kind of verbose, so things that are longer. And over here, we have terse, which are, you know, sentences that are shorter. So, you know, kind of on the smaller side, like we've got tests. You know, it's usually if you're in object-oriented, you want to do some solid programming. Writing error messages, writing good commit titles, architecture decision records, that's what ADR stands for. Writing why you made a decision, that is a huge one. So when I was in copywriting, when I was in marketing, so my job was to come up with a tagline for, you know, a company. And it was like between 3 and 7 words. That was it. And so the work was not so much describing, like coming up with that. It was developing the rationale that talked about why this decision would work. And that's something that I see missing a lot. And so when I talk to people, I usually say, you know, remember that your commits have 2 different parts. There's the title, but then there's also the description. And my friend Dave Bach describes it as, you know, the title should be the size of half a tweet, and this was before they like extended the tweets, right? So like maybe a quarter of a tweet now. But the description should be the length of a blog post if necessary. And the reason that I like tying our rationale to the commits is because then it's very tightly coupled to the code itself, right? So rather than putting it like in comments, like in inline comments, or in putting it in a wiki that is kind of likely to get out of date, being able to put it into the code so then that way you can easily archive it and extract it, that's usually where we recommend it. Over here, you know, you've got retros, meeting notes, you know, all of the issues, your JIRA tickets, pull requests, over here, timesheets. So I'll tell you, like, we actually use the comment field in our timesheets, and I always get eye rolls, always. Who likes filling out timesheets? Timesheets are a way to communicate what you did. And so for us, like, that's a practice that we do with our clients, and it builds a massive amount of trust. So thinking about just all these different ways of how is someone going to interpret this, how are they going to read it, because that's what our clients look at. So, and I can go on. So, like I mentioned, every single artifact that you build delivers trust. If I were to leave something blank, or to say, I just don't have time for that, I have to go build the next feature, right? We are making the conscious choice to not connect with somebody and to not build trust. And I like to think of it, so Brené Brown in her book again, she talks about trust as marbles in a jar. She talks about how when her daughter came home from school one day, she was talking about her teacher, whenever the class did something well, they would put a marble in the jar. And that's kind of what happens with us. Trust is not something that you build up just all of a sudden. Now I trust you. Trust is built by teensy, tiny interactions over time and consistently, right? So every time I deliver on a promise, every time I anticipate someone's needs, every time I am open and honest and build rapport, that puts a marble in the jar. And that is how we build up trust, right? So the metaphor that I kind of like to use is the idea of fission. And so fission is the physics principle that is the way to create a massive amount of energy very, very quickly. So if you want to infuse your teams with lots and lots of trust, which will then enable them to collaborate better, which will then allow you to deliver software more quickly, the fastest way that I have found and that we've done on our team is to practice leaving really good communication artifacts. Right? Because then that builds up the trust significantly. Now, one of the things I get is like, Andrea, you know, you're talking about documentation here, and we're Agile, and we just don't do a lot of documentation, right? I would argue that this process is a little bit different because we're not planning out the requirements and we're not writing all the documentation first. This is an emergent documentation process. And it fits very well with the process of developing software. So here are a couple of, So here are a couple of examples. I know the type's kind of small to read, right? So Llewellyn Falco said, you know, one of the things he started incorporating is documentation as part of his definition of done. So he doesn't consider a task done until he's gone and updated the documentation to say what he's done. And he said this process has been transformative in some of the open source projects that he manages. Arlo Belshi up here has a great article on the 7 stages of naming, right? You don't come up with a perfect name, you know, right off the bat. It's a process, right? He also has a really good commit notation, right? So I love his process about how he does those commits. And he's got like this whole thing here about using F for feature and B for bug, and then he has kind of a little thing. So then that way, when he uses this consistently, he builds up trust in the system. And so when he does something that doesn't change the code, it's a pure refactoring, then they know that they can merge it just right away and really quickly, right? And then one other is architecture and decision records. And so Nat Price has some really great tools that run on the command line. So just when you make a change to the architecture, document your thinking, and then it gets coupled nicely with the code base, right? So these aren't things that are like, oh, the business, and I'm building all this documentation. No, this is just part of what we're doing to create a very healthy software ecosystem. All right, so how do we use empathy to create some of these artifacts? So when I was first developing this, I came at this from a like, I don't know, I just do it, right? And so Scott really encouraged me to build kind of a type of framework. So recognize that while this might look like it takes a whole lot of time, when you practice it and when you get really good at it and when you get into that raw kind of state where you're able to just kind of notice what levers you need to pull, this becomes instinct. And kind of just knowing which artifacts you need to create takes 30 seconds to maybe 2 minutes, right? It's not this big, long process, but it will look like a big, long process because that's my attempt to kind of explain it in a shoe kind of way, shoebox. So if TDD can be distilled into red, green, refactor, right? That's kind of the basis of if you were to describe TDD. Empathy and, you know, kind of empathy-driven development is kind of the term because why not? I think of it as audience and action, right? So that's that perspective-taking problem solving, right? You have to first understand your audience, and then you need to do something, right? So we'll walk through this pretty quickly. So the first thing is you need to identify who you're talking to, right? There are a lot of different people. And this is exactly what I was trained to do in marketing. So the way that you identify individuals is first you start with a big group, right? So it might be that you think of product managers, right? Or accountants, or, you know, customers, right? But then you need to narrow it down. You can't just say that. And so you narrow down to a role, right? So if you're thinking customers, it might be, you know, a particular segment of customers. And then you have to go even further. And you need to think of a specific individual that you are writing to. This is the trick. Our brains can't write to groups of people. We form empathetic connections with individuals. So imagine that individual. Sam Horn was one of my mentors. I had the opportunity to work with her, and she's one of the foremost experts on branding and taglines and all of this stuff. She's amazing. And she has this idea called the empathy telescope that says that you have to zoom in to really understand what somebody is doing. And in order to do that, you have to create a personal connection with that person. So kind of here's an idea, right? So you start with yourself. Usually that's a great way to start because you kind of know yourself, hopefully. Next, you probably know the people on your team pretty well, right? So that might be if you have a pair partner or if you're in a mob, right? Or, you know, maybe the person who's coding in the cubicle next to you. Next, you've got your customers. You likely have a persona about them, right? And then probably your coworkers. Maybe there's a business analyst who works on your team. You don't interact with them every day, but you kind of know them. And then finally, maybe the stakeholders, right? So the CFO, and like you've seen their picture on the website, but you've never met them in person, right? So just doing that and just saying, oh, the CFO. No. We do names, right? You think, okay, what is Susan going to need? How can I impact Susan's life? And that's the individual that you have in mind. So zooming in really close so that you've got a name is a critical part of building empathy and writing these communication artifacts. Personas can be useful. Your UX department, if you work in an organization that has them, very, very likely has them. And I can guarantee you that they would love it if you went and asked for them and then used them. Because these things just sitting on a shelf don't do much use. All right, so the next step is to consider the context, right? So now that we've figured out the individual, we're thinking about what situation are they finding themselves in, right? So what is their environment, right? Do they have a really messy desk, or do they think about things really clean? How are they feeling, right? Are they rushed all the time, or are they really calm? Or maybe, you know, they had a family situation where they're feeling really sad, or they're feeling really happy, right? We are judged, like we act differently when we have different situations. You know, what are they likely to do? What have they tried in the past? Here's the really important thing. We do not assume, right? So if you try doing this and you get a null, right? You're like, I have no idea. That's when you have to do that research. That's when you have to go develop that empathy by talking to people and asking questions. So here's an example, right? This could be the same person, right? Let's say an Olympic athlete. They're on their A game, they're getting ready to run, right? Their mindset is very different when they start a race versus maybe they're going to a funeral for a friend, right? So same person, different context. Context really, really, really matters when you're building empathy. All right, so next is you figured out who you're talking to and what their situation is. Now you need to think about what do they need in that situation. So some examples here are like, what are their preferences, right? What are their goals? How do they like to receive information? Do they like to talk on the phone, or do they prefer an email? What does success look like to them? What's going to reduce their stress? And again, if you don't know, you need to develop some research, right? Go out and ask. Do some observations, right? But assuming leads to bias and stereotypes. Listening sessions, again, Indy Young in her book Practical Empathy goes into this in depth. But when you're doing that research, you want to listen to 3 things: reasoning, reactions, and guiding principles. Right? So you're listening to the emotions that lie underneath the words. And that takes a little bit of practice, but again, it's a skill that can be developed. All right, so now we move into the action phase. All right, so we've got a really good sense of our audience. We've got a really good sense of what their context is. We understand what they need. Now it's time to do something to help them. This is where I get excited. So the first thing is you think about, like, what's the best action? So given infinite resources, all the time, all the money, all the knowledge, everything that you know, there are 0 constraints. What would you do, right? This is big blue sky. We're thinking about what's the ideal solution, what would make the biggest impact. You know, what if you had no constraints? You know, what would you do? And the reason that we do this first is because we want to generate the ideas that are big constraints, that are without constraints, because it could be that we could remove some constraints in order to implement that solution if we have the right rationale, right? So if we come up with a really good idea and then we provide our rationale and say, but we need some more money to do this, that's a block that's an impediment that could be removed. Right? But if we limit our thinking to the constraints first, we're not going to be developing those big, bold ideas that actually make traction. Right? So big, big, big blue sky. All right, so then we think about constraints. Because, you know, real world, we can't actually implement everything we want. We do have real world constraints. Some of the biggest ones, so thinking through, like, what constraints do you have, and given those, kind of what's possible within that context, what's the next best alternative? So if you can't create something that's amazing and would take all this production time, what can you do that's really low fidelity and low effort that's going to drive maybe, you know, some of the impact, right? And will at least keep those ideas moving forward. And what's the least thing you could do? What's the smallest thing that you can do to add just a little bit of value, right? So I find that there's kind of 3 different main constraints. So thinking through kind of what, these are maybe frames or lenses that you might want to put on. So time, right? We're under crunch time. We said we would deliver this on time. We've got release schedules, you know, things like that. Ideally, you know, we would move to a fully integrated CI/CD pipeline where everything is just deployed on demand. But I found that, you know, that's a goal that a lot of people just haven't gotten to yet. So it's something that we definitely want to work towards. But if you don't have that and you're kind of under a time constraint, what can you do under the situation that you're in? Money is a constraint. And then also knowledge, right? So you might try for hitting here, but you know, you hit over here, right? But eventually with practice, you kind of get more close to the middle. All right, so then you create your artifacts, right? And like I said, this seems like kind of a big thing. But eventually, you build into the habit and it becomes a little bit more fluid and natural. And so what you want to do is incorporate all of the things you've learned by going through this mindfulness exercise. And you want to incorporate that into your primary artifact. And then you deliver it. And then it doesn't quite stop there. Because if we only deliver kind of that one thing, we're not taking advantage of that trust vision, right? We want to deliver something extra that's going to propel that idea and really deliver trust. So I call these secondary artifacts. And so basically you might list out kind of what are all the different things that you could do. So for example, Llewellyn with, you know, okay, after I deliver this thing, I'm going to also update the documentation, and that is then my definition of done. And you include kind of whatever that secondary artifact is into your definition of done. And when everybody on your team starts doing that, builds a lot of trust and things start moving fast. And then you run through the process recursively. So next time you deliver an artifact, go through the same process again. So here's kind of a chart. I know that the stuff's hard to read, but if you wanted to kind of practice, like think through, you know, you can kind of look at audience, action, and then these are all of the different kind of things. So here are the individuals. So this might be like a freelance artist right? But he's using the app, he's on the go, he's not at his mobile computer because he's meeting with clients all the time. And so then, you know, what does he need? And you just kind of run through. So this might be a chart that might help you if you're kind of trying to think through how to do things, you know, and you're in this practice situation. And then referring back to the chart here, which again, I would encourage you to do with your own teams to figure out what communications actually matter, what communication artifacts actually matter to you and your teams. You know, go through and just be mindful when you create these things. Be mindful that these are really good secondary artifacts. Is there something that we forget? Like when we change the architecture, am I remembering to put an architecture decision record so that that decision is then codified into the code base and the rationale is there, right? So if you get nothing else out of this talk, there's one thing I want you to remember, and this is the first step. This is actually a pre-first step to realizing that empathy is a skill. And that is to remember that you are not coding for the computer. When I've talked to engineers over the past 10 years, one of the things that I find is that you get so used to working with the computer that you start to personify it a little bit. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But we need to remember that the computer is a tool. The source code is a tool to help us deliver value to other humans. And when you start to imagine who all of those other humans are, things start to change. And one example of this is that we don't code in ones and zeros anymore. We write in compiled languages because they are easier to read for humans, right? The computer only cares about the ones and zeros. And so what are some other ways, you know, in addition to making your code self-revealing and well-tested, what are some other ways that you can use these emergent principles to make your software easier for other humans? And I would argue that then the legacy that you will leave behind is something that's very positive. Because when we think about legacy, we think about what are we leaving behind? In every other context, at least in English, legacy is a very, very positive term. It's the legacy that I'm leaving behind after I'm gone, right? It's an intentional thing. And so how can we change that frame of reference where legacy code is just the code that was like, oh, nobody cared about that? How can we imbue our intention into it so that the legacy we're leaving behind is something that other people can take up the mantle and continue to develop? So some key takeaways is to remember that empathy is a skill. It's a technical skill. It's a technical skill that is critical in software. Empathy is a skill that you can develop, right, by practice. And the way that I've kind of defined that is proactive perspective taking and problem solving. There's a lot of different definitions. I would encourage you to go do the research yourself. Without empathy, we get an unhealthy and toxic culture, and it makes it difficult to maintain and sustain quality software. If you think about empathy-driven development and you like that framework, you know, TDD is red, green, refactor. You can think of empathy-driven development as audience and action, right? Who is my audience? What situation are they in? And then what action am I going to take to develop that software and move that software along? You can practice empathy by leaving really good artifacts of your thinking for other people to find. Throughout this process, the goal is to invoke curiosity, respect, and non-judgment, and also avoiding assumptions. So that's what I've got. My contact information is on the screen. And thank you all very much.
Thank you, Andrea. Do we have time for a question or two? Anyone?
Absolutely. I love questions.
If you raise your hand really high, because there's a lot of you and I won't be able to see it. Yes, we have up there. There we go. I missed him. Where is he? There he is.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. It was super interesting. I have a question. How can I influence other people with my behavior to help them improve their empathy? So I can take some actions, your nice suggestions, but can I do something to help them also increase their empathy, their empathetical skills?
Yeah, I think
Thanks.
so. So I think the first step is to get really good at it yourself, right? So just like with any skill, right? Start with yourself, right? If rather than saying, I saw this talk about empathy and now we are going to have empathy, right? That tends to not work as well. But if you take more of a servant leadership type of role, where you say, I'm going to get really good at learning how to build rapport with other people. I'm going to get really good at leaving these communication artifacts, right? You might find that people are curious about, how are you delivering so well? Well, I've noticed that you might have changed. And then it's an opportunity to kind of bring that up. I mean, another example would be, if you're managing a team, you can start to say, okay, folks, here's kind of the standard, right? So a style guide is sometimes good for communication artifacts. But I say that sometimes, we can think about like the cognitive empathy and just doing just the style guides, but that's kind of leaving behind the emotional side of it as well. My suggestion is to just start with yourself, right? And then start with somebody else on your team, that concentric circle, right? So who's your pair partner, or who's somebody that you work with closely every day, right? How can you build more trust and empathy with them? And then once the two of you have gotten really good at, how can you then do it on your team, right? And then it can build out and out. And clearly, I mean, if you're the CEO and you're kind of in the executive, then you can kind of have more of an impact. But definitely kind of a start where you are type of approach.
Any more? Yes. Help me out, thank you.
Hi, Andrea. Good to see you.
Thank you. You too.
Often, from what I've seen, empathy and emotions and feelings are kind of perceived like weak characteristics, and often more female characteristics.
Yeah.
You're not a very good and strong boss if you are a female human who has feelings.
Yes.
So how do you respond to that? Please help me out.
Yes, I feel that very deeply. So I would encourage you to read Brené Brown's work. So from the research that she's done, she has shown that the leaders who get the most creativity, innovation, and can navigate change the best, otherwise leaders that are effective, one of the key traits that they have is vulnerability, right? There's also, if you're able to watch, there's a special that she has on Netflix. She also has some TED Talks. So being able to just kind of look at this. So the way that you're able to reframe vulnerability, we're actually entering a good time, because I think her work is starting to kind of permeate the consciousness. And we're realizing that the command and control, strong boss, I'm going to yell at you, that isn't very effective. And so, at least on the business side, right, there is more recognition that being more open, being more transparent, being more vulnerable can be a source of strength. So her book, her work specifically completely changed the way that I lead. When I first started, my slogan was, I'm not type A, which means like I like everything like command and control, like I like having everything where it's supposed to be. Somebody told me about Greek suggested time, right? Like I am struggling in the Greek suggested time kind of world. I like things starting where they are. But yeah, my slogan used to be, I'm not type A, I'm type A plus. Like I will have everything ready. And what ends up happening when you live in that world is you get shame, you get, like I had burnout, right? Like you get all these kind of negative things. And just like shame, empathy is the antidote to shame. We've got a lot of those kind of things for vulnerability as well, where being open and being honest and sharing your emotions are seen now as signs of strength and not weakness. So, yeah.
And I'll take one more, but only one more, if we have one. There we are.
I can speak and everyone can listen to me as always. Hi. So my question is, if you have a really good advice for the people that are in hiring positions, hiring managers, that would make them realize that empathy is not a weakness, as you said. What can we tell to those people to realize that is not a weakness?
Yeah, I think some of it is in the questions. Like, so if you're putting together maybe a job requisition, we call it job rec, right? And putting together what are the skills that are needed for this, right? If you're hiring, like, put that as a skill, right? That you need to collaborate, you need to demonstrate empathy, right? We've done that, and we've actually had tremendous success. We've had amazing applicants who have applied for us because we said that we were looking for somebody with empathy. So, you know, it depends on kind of how much influence you have there, but there's a lot of demonstration that kind of that skill in particular can be really effective for collaboration and things like that. So I would say maybe doing some research, bringing that back, but then just putting it into the, like, baking it into the recruiting process. This is kind of what we've done. So for us, like, our #1 core value is act with empathy, right? And people were like, you're a software company. I was like, yes. And that's our #1 core value. So people come to us for that. You know, we've got it listed when we post a job description. It's very clear, like, this is what we're looking for. And then when we're doing the interview process, we're asking questions in, you know, kind of the scenarios of, like, tell me a time, tell me a time that something was a struggle and, you know, you approached it with empathy. Or tell me about a time that it was difficult for you to see someone else's point of view, but then you worked on it, and what resolution did you get to? So there are some ways to kind of build this into the recruiting process, but it does take a little bit of work and collaboration. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
What kind of...
Oh.
You say it's better without...
Yeah.
So what
so how do you influence the recruiter?
The recruiter, the hiring manager?
Yeah, how do you influence? So same practice, right? So you run through the scenario, you figure out kind of what is it that they need, what are their challenges, right? You run through that 6-step process, and you figure out what is it that they're struggling with, what are their challenges, and you approach it from a place of trying to understand their world first, and then the solution will emerge. You act with empathy towards the hiring manager, you build that rapport, and then the solution for whatever that context is will be emergent. So, thank you all very much. Appreciate it.